Welcome, dear readers. You're listening to Time to Read, a Winnipeg Public Library podcast. We are recording in the acoustically gifted Carol Shields Auditorium in the iconic Millennium Library here in Treaty 1 territory and on land that is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Today we will be discussing Washington Black by Esi Edugyan. I'm Trevor Lockhart, the branch head librarian of the Louis Riel Library, and to my left is...
I'm Sappfyre McLeod. I am one of the co-facilitators at Blackspace for a project called Project Heal that focuses on Black mental health here in Winnipeg. And to my left is...
Alexa Potashnik, founder and president of Blackspace Winnipeg, and I wear several other hats in the community, but I will say that right now. And to my left is...
Hi, I'm Erica Ball. I'm the branch head librarian at Fort Garry Library.
A good book can carry me away from an average and ordinary day, yeah. So keep it down, leave me alone, close the doors and turn off the phone, 'cause all I ever really need is a little more time to read.
And of course, we couldn't do this without you, dear readers. Since this book club is a little more long distance than most, we'd love to have you join in our discussions, no matter where you are in the world. So email us at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca or find our new Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/TTR podcast. You have to request to join, but we're happy to have you in our special club. Remember, only you can determine whether we laugh or cry. To find out if your comments made it on air, subscribe to Time to Read on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find your podcasts. Before we launch into a discussion of Washington Black, regular listeners will notice we've given Alan and Kirsten the month off, but the joke's on them because Eric and I get to welcome Alexa and Sappfyre to the podcast.
Yay!
Alexa and Sappfyre, welcome to Time to Read.
Thank you for having us.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves, maybe about how Blackspace Winnipeg started, some of the things that you're up to?
Sure, I'll go first. How Blackspace Winnipeg started is a very long story, so I won't take up too much time. But basically, we've been going for the past 3 years. We started in 2016 and really pushing the conversation of anti-Black racism and discrimination and how to challenge it through a number of initiatives done by our collective, from our Afrocentric Artist Showcase, Nuit Noir, to our Afro Prairie Film Festival, which is coming up February 21st to 24th. Shameless plug over here. We encourage everyone to come. And of course, Project Heal, which Sappfyre can speak to a little bit more.
So like Alexa said, I'm Sappfyre. My involvement with Blackspace Winnipeg has been through a mental health initiative called Project Heal. It's honestly such a joy and a privilege to work on the project. As the topic of mental health becomes more and more discussed, it becomes a beautiful foreground for people to talk and share and express and grow in their own personal struggles. At the same time, access to mental health services is quite a challenge, whether you're Black or not, and even more so when you are a person of color within this province. So we decided that we'd try and fill that gap by providing a mental health space for people in our community. And it's been such a joy. We've really built a sense of like family within that program, and I can't wait to keep on doing that.
It sounds amazing.
That's great. We're so happy you guys are here today. And so for you listeners, send your questions, thoughts, and comments anytime to wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca or find us on social media, and we'll incorporate your thoughts on the air. Please make sure you stick around to the end of our podcast for a special segment, Nerd Word for Word Nerds. And one last thing, if you haven't read Washington Black by Esi Edugyan, now is your last chance to press pause, because I'm going to give a brief author bio, followed by Erica, who's going to spoil everything with a brief synopsis. Don't worry, we'll wait. Esi Edugyan is a Canadian writer and multiple award-winning novelist. She grew up in Calgary, Alberta, to Ghanaian immigrant parents and currently lives in Victoria, BC. Edugyan describes growing up in Alberta in the 1980s as not being a racially diverse place, and that she felt very conspicuous everywhere she went. She thinks perhaps this is why she looks at stories of folks who aren't necessarily part of the social fabric, and that her need to look for the most marginalized within the marginalized comes out of her own experiences in childhood. Despite international kudos for her first novel, The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, Edugyan had a very difficult time finding a publisher. During her time as writer-in-residence in Stuttgart, Germany, she wrote what would become her Gilbert Prize-winning novel, Half-Blood Blues, a book that at first was repeatedly rejected by editors and was in fact rejected 3 times by the same publisher. Edugyan has become known as a historical novelist, born out of her natural curiosity and love of research. Her writing ritual often involves reading a beautifully written piece of prose for an hour or so before sitting down to her own work. Her own reading choices are varied and eclectic. In one interview, she said that on her writing desk at the same time, there was a book on Patty Hearst, a book on cave art, and a book of poetry on 18th century gardens. Edugyan has said that stories of the marginalized, it's extremely important to get those out there and for us to be reading them and trying to imagine ourselves into other skins and not closing ourselves down. It's part of, I think, keeping the dialogue alive and keeping empathy alive. Washington Black is her 3rd novel.
Nice. Learn something new every time from those bios.
And thanks to Kirsten for putting that together.
Yeah. Washington Black is the story of George Washington Black, a young field slave born on a Barbados sugar plantation. When his master's eccentric brother chooses him as a manservant, Wash is terrified of the cruelties he is certain await him. But Christopher Wilde, or Titch, is a naturalist, explorer, scientist, inventor, and abolitionist. He initiates Wash into a world of technology and science, where a flying machine can carry a man across the sky, where 2 people separated by circumstances of birth might begin to see each other as human, and where a boy born in chains can embrace a life of dignity and meaning. When a bounty is placed on Wash's head, Titch and Wash escape in a fable-like flight across the eastern coast of America, and finally to a remote outpost in the Arctic. There Wash, suddenly left on his own, must invent himself anew and is again adrift across the globe. From the sticky heat of Caribbean cane fields to the frozen far north to the deserts of Morocco, it's the story of what people can mean to each other, what people owe each other, and how impossibly complicated friendship and love can be. And that's adapted from the Goodreads blurb.
So, Alexa, I'd like to start with you because normally when we select books, it's a combination of books that our readers and listeners have suggested or books that we've come up with between the 4 of us. And so for this episode, we asked you to come up with the book choice, and you picked Washington Black. So can you maybe tell us a little bit maybe why you picked this book and some of your initial thoughts?
Sure. Her other book actually was first suggested,
Half-Blood Blues.
Yes. Yeah. And I thought, honestly, since Washington Black has been getting so much buzz lately, that it would be a great read. And it provides, I think, a very strong insight of some of the realities that happened in that time during slavery. And I also really wanted to support and encourage readers and, folks who love to read, books by Black women and Black Canadian women. I think it's really important. And other amazing writers like Dion Brand and like David Cheriandy. I think Canada really needs to pay attention and provide more platforms and opportunities for Black writers across the country.
It was definitely a great pick. Like it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, and for those of you who had difficulty finding it because of its popularity, I know many of you relied on our collection of Express bestsellers, which if you're not familiar with that, something that Winnipeg Public Library does where we set aside a certain number of new or popular books, and they have a special designation where when they're checked in, they don't go and fill holds, so they go right back on the shelf. So if you're really determined to read a popular book like Washington Black, you can call a library. We could look and see which library has them checked in, and you can check them out. And so I know a lot of our readers used the Express bestseller if they hadn't gone out and bought a copy too, which I think, Alexis, you may have done.
Yeah, I bought it for Sappfyre myself because there was nothing left
at all.
At all. We went to McNally and we picked up a couple copies.
It's either that or the Michelle Obama book. Those are the two that are super popular now. So,
pretty much.
Yeah. Sappfyre, how about you? Did you have any initial thoughts about Washington Black?
Initially,
honestly,
Kate, it was a little adventure getting the book and then starting it. I got to the 37th page and I had to put it down. I was really confused at first as to like what this book would explore. Like it takes place on a plantation, but it's not a slavery novel. And I was really pleased about that. And the first 37 pages, I was like, okay, I know what to expect. Okay, it's a young Black boy on a sugar plantation. It'll be like every other slave narrative I've ever heard. And then it goes into some benevolent, erratic, like weird, strange character comes and scoops this little boy up. And then you're like, oh, something ungodly is going to happen to this child. It's like, okay, I know what to expect. And it goes completely sideways. It talks about, like, in the first little part of the book, it talks about his future, it talks about his past, and it's a little dizzying, but at the same time, I was very intrigued. So after I put the book down, I gave it some time, gave myself time to brace and prepare, because I was like, okay, I really have no idea what this book is going to be about. And then I took it up and I finished it in my other sitting.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. One of our listeners, Carrie, who says she uses the Hoopla, and Libby mentioned some of her thoughts about the novel. One of the things that she said that she thought was interesting was when Titch and Wash first connected, and how Titch took him away from the plantation as home and his family. And she said that made her think of the residential schools in Canada and the similar idea of how a dominant culture that thinks they know what's best and, remove somebody from their own culture. And I thought that was an interesting connection to make. I hadn't thought of it when I was reading it, but it stood out to me that, that these injustices are universal between any dominant culture that's oppressing someone else. So I just thought I'd just throw that in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a part in the book where through a series of events, they end up in the North, in the Arctic. And I thought it was really interesting to see how in the States and in the islands, like there's clearly blatantly like anti-Black racism. But when they touched into the North, there was like a little snippet of how you could see like the explorers' interactions with the Indigenous folks up North. And you could see like it shifted a little bit. Whereas Washington is used to having like really off-put remarks directed at him or people not acknowledging his presence. In the Arctic, people had off-put things to say about the Indigenous people there, or like they're strange or they're savage or whatever. And it was interesting to see how that was reflected in the book. I thought it was well put, how there's like a similar struggle between the two and how like these struggles can often marry each other. So though when they're in the Arctic, no one acknowledged Washington's presence. Like very few people looked at him other than Titch and his father and Peter House. In the Arctic now, they would tell you like off-put things about like the adventurers and the explorers and the outposts and the natives of the land there.
Blackspace Winnipeg, in partnership with the Winnipeg Film Group and Winnipeg Cinematheque, are proud to present the 2019 Second Annual Afro Prairie Film Festival in celebration of Black History Month from February 21st to 24th. For 4 days, the festival celebrates Black cinema across North America, promotes the work of established and emerging Black filmmakers from right here in Manitoba, and participants can look forward to a weekend filled with programming and filmmaking that explores Black narratives. Passes are on sale right now for $40 and $30 for students and seniors and Winnipeg Film Group members. We have the lovely Ella Cooper joining us from Black Women Film Canada, and Karen Chapman, who will be coming in to do some assessments of her work. And it'll happen at Cinematheque at 100 Arthur Street all weekend. Yeah, see you there.
One of the recurring themes that stood out to me throughout the book was the whole idea of the rebirth imagery. You know, in the beginning, in the first chapters, Big Kit is talking about dying and being reborn in Dahomey. And then later on, Wash is sort of reborn as a sort of a lab assistant or as a scientist. And then later on, I couldn't help but thinking about that scene where Wash puts on the diving equipment and goes down to look for specimens. It was almost like a baptism scene or something, that when he comes up again, his Goss or Goff, what was Tana's father, was starting to treat him almost as an equal at that point, trusting him to go down and do things he would have trusted his own daughter to do. So that's the other thing about fiction that I think is great, is that for someone like myself, I can't just sort of let things go without going back and rereading them. So I did a little research on Dahomey, and it actually was a real kingdom in Africa. It's in present-day Benin. It was around from 1600 to 1894. And that became a French protectorate. And one interesting thing about Dahomey that I read was that it had an all-female military unit called the Dahomey Amazons. And they were an inspiration for the Dora Milaje from Black Panther in Wakanda. So I thought, wow, so these are the little things you can learn from reading fiction. It was great.
I love that.
Actually, when you bring up Black Panther and the scene where he basically wakes up in his ancestor land, if anyone has seen the movie, and he goes and he wakes up in the dream and he talks to his father. I think, like you said, like that reoccurring thing of rebirth is something that honestly is very powerful. And the relationship between Big Kit and Titch was reading it at first, I saw how special it was. When you figure out that that's his mom, it just...
What?
Yeah, like, but it made sense though at the same time. It totally made sense because of how nurturing and protective she was over him. But at the same time, not to try to show too much protection and still have that type of that distance and safeguard because of the horrific realities of being on a plantation in that time. So I thought it was the story between Titch and Big Kit.
Wash.
Wash was very, very beautiful.
Yeah, and what Sappfyre was saying too about how you think the book's going to go in a certain direction and then it totally veers off and goes another way. And so I don't know how you guys thought about that reveal of Big Kit being Wash's mom, but for me, I did not see it coming.
Really?
No,
even though after it happened, I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But I was totally broadsided by it. But anyway, that's just me.
I'm going to be a total know-it-all and be all like, I kind of thought that that's what it would be. The only thing that, and because at one point she calls him my boy or something, and I just thought that was kind of uncharacteristic of her. But the only thing that I couldn't really wrap my head around is why she would have hidden that from him. So
I think it comes back to the protection and the fact that, like, historically Black families were sold and, you know, broken up on the plantation and across the Caribbean and North America. And I think that kind of motherly safeguard protection, but at the same time, I think it was to her benefit too, to not have such a strong hold on him, because I'm sure in the back of her head, she was thinking, I don't know how long this is going to last and when he's going to be taken away from me. So I think that's one reason why she wouldn't tell him, honestly.
Because anything could happen to either of them at any moment.
Yeah.
Well, and also, you know, if it was maybe public knowledge that Wash was her son, then the slave owners could use that as leverage and you know, single them out. And then when Titch finally did abscond with Wash, you know, he lost everything, but he didn't also knowingly lose his mother, which would have been an even bigger or one more horrible thing. I mean, he lost his, you know, although it's weird when you think, oh, it's a horrible thing that he left the plantation. Maybe it wasn't such a horrible thing. Yeah, he had his whole life, but that was his whole life. That's all he knew. It
was neat about that point about him being removed from everything he knew and from his roots, but at the same time he was being saved. So it's a complicated thing. Do you look at it as a good thing or a bad thing that he got out of there? Right.
Yeah, no, it's very layered, and like you can see Wash himself kind of struggle with it. And it was interesting in his talk with John Willard, and then before that with Peter. Peter is the cousin, right?
Philip.
No, Philip is the cousin. Yeah. Thank you. Wrong pew. Yeah. You can see how they both pose this thought to him, like, you must have had it so easy. Your everyday lined out for you. Like slavery, you didn't have to think about anything else. And
that was bizarre.
You could have everything, like you could just exist. Show up and have an easy life. You don't know. It's almost like they were telling him that you don't know my struggle, and as such, I will enjoy yours or add to yours. And I thought that was like really, really interesting. And then going off of what you were saying previously, or I guess I should add to like why I thought that was interesting, is because though it's not a narrative that I've heard to my face, like, oh, slavery must have been such an easy thing, like your food and lodgings were like provided for you. It is a thought that people have. And then when Wash goes on his adventure to find Titch and ends up at Titch's mother's house, and she was like, no, they were employed and paid royally.
That part of the book actually pissed me off. I was like, sorry, I don't mean to.
No, go for it.
It's hard for me actually to read any type of narrative during the slave trade. It's just, it's a difficult read because there's so much pain and history within this text, right? Things that I'm sure we can't even imagine that happened. But and it's like Sappfyre said, it's so layered because at the same time, even though Titch kind of chose him and he's introduced to this world of technology and science and he has purpose to his life, like it's still so devastating that no matter where he was, his freedom, either through freedom from the plantation or freedom from slavery, freedom from a mental slavery, freedom from, capture and all of that stuff still had to be given to him from a white man. And I think that was the hardest thing for me to grasp in this book. And then he longed for Titch and he went to go look for him. Like, I don't know how many continents he went to. Like in Europe, he went to Germany, he went to Morocco. Like
he was like Carmen Sandiego.
Yeah, like because he abandoned him, and that's all he knew. And I thought that act of abandonment was extremely selfish. I understood why it happened, but it's so interesting to read this book and think that the idea of freedom was always presented and given to Wash rather than liberating himself.
Yeah. I found myself upset at him for continuing to Titch, and I was just like, just build your life. Just you could take charge now, as much as possible in that time and place. But yeah, he was just so tied to needing Titch's validation or something. And it was upsetting.
We could see your frustration mirrored in Tiana.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought that was, their dynamic was really interesting. One of the themes that I found in the book was like love and family. And it was just like a very interesting take on the whole thing. Another theme was like violence and darkness and how it's like within us all and how far do you want to jump into that. So those are like very, very interesting themes. But when it came to Washington's desire to find Titch, I found Tiana like almost a voice of reason, but she was like the voice of reason with a sledgehammer.
And then she'd do what he wanted anyway. Yeah. So she's like, all right, I'll come with you.
Exactly. And so like one of the things I found really interesting about their dynamic was this air of dependency. So like you meet the two of them like on a beach, and like it was so interesting when I was reading. I was like, you know what, it'd be so cool if Wash could fall in love. And by the time I get to like part 4, I'm like, you know what, it's okay, it's not gonna happen. And then boom, he meets Tiana. It's like, yes.
Yeah. I know. I really like Tiana too. And although sometimes she said things that just were like, I know she was well-meaning, but I remember she had that one line where she said, "Oh, well, you were never really a slave." And she meant it as a compliment, as if to say like, oh yeah, you were so self-resilient. And then Wash was like, what do you mean? It's not like it was a personal failing, like a personality defect that I was a slave. Like, but the way that she saw it was that it was more of a sort of a mental thing or that he had the perseverance to survive it. But again, it goes back to the idea of unless you've lived through it, you have all these inaccurate or biased thoughts of it, even if you're well-meaning. She didn't mean it to be cruel. She was trying to say it as a kindness, but it came off wrong.
Just ignorant.
Yeah, you can kind of see it then start to develop this sense of like, oh, I'm intrigued by you, but like I want you to need me. You don't need me, but I'll need you to need me, and I'll make you need me. And then when you need me, oh, you know what do you think? Let me put this on you, and it's now I need to be needed. And this weird dynamic that kept on going back and forth between the two of them. And then what kind of made me scoff or like laugh a little in the book was when they traveled all the way to Amsterdam, reunited with Peter, met Peter's son, and learned that Titch is in Morocco.
Right.
I love how she already knew that Titch would want to go. And like, even though she said everything she wanted to say and gave her own opinions on the matter, she's like, I'll go with you. Yeah. And it's like, sis, why? Why? So it's like now she's like limited herself to a spot where she needs to be needed by Titch and like entertain him the same way that she entertains her father. Like that needs to be needed, that needs to make you happy and to fill that void, and I'll contort myself to you. And I feel like that's a dynamic we see in like lots of relationships. And
well, and I don't think it's really touched upon that much in the book, but Tana is an interesting character because I think maybe you guys pick this up or not. Did you get the sense that she was biracial?
Yes.
Because like she was from the Solomon Islands and her mom died, but she had a bunch of step siblings that were back in England, and there were a couple of lines her dad said, oh, she doesn't quite fit in, or and so she has this interesting kind of background too, where maybe she relate a little closer to Wash's experiences by also feeling like not fitting in or not quite ever fitting in wherever she is, whether it's because she's biracial, whether it's because she's a woman in a time when science was done by old white men. And but anyway, I thought that was an interesting little, and the cool thing in the book was that it wasn't sort of like it didn't hit you over the head with it. It just kind of mentions it and then moves on from there. And then I just
yeah, that's what I thought was going on as well.
There's a part in the book where Tiana, I think it's on page 378, and she's talking about beauty. Like, I got the sense that she was biracial also. I got the sense that her dad was a white man just by like how easily he was able to move through the world and go to different provinces and be respected and have published works. Kind of gave insight to that. But like, obviously Tiana's a very beautiful woman. She's with Titch after one night and she talks about beauty. She's like, am I plain then? She's like, no. And then she goes into like why she's never in the best clothes or why she never wears jewelry. So it starts on page 377 and it goes, so I am plain. She addresses Washington. And then he replies by, surely you noticed Peter has staring at you. You augment your beauty gently with small things so that your actual features are more noticeable. And she responds by saying, you've been reading a manual on how to make love to a woman, I see. God save us. She smiles faintly. The irony is that, she continues, for years and years, I've begged my father to allow me to wear jewels and to paint my face and to dress in the latest fashions. And he resisted me for a long time, long past the point of when such a thing was natural for a girl my age. When he finally allowed it, I was given a purse of money and told I could purchase the 4 items I desired most. A dress of pale muslin, a handbag with a single emerald clasp, a skin powder, and a very red lipstick. I put them on at once. Wash replies, and you looked garish like a street mime. She interrupts it by saying, I looked breathtaking, like a very living doll. My father was so astounded by the transformation that he apologized for having so long refused me. I think he saw at once the fine match I would make, the easy life I might have as a beauty. And yet, something happened to me. Dressed so, I became emphasized in the world, sharpened. I stood out, and I felt the constant touch of others' eyes. And the more people looked, the more affected I felt. I felt as if I were disappearing. It was the strangest feeling. I did not feel as though all those glances were scraping away at some essence, though that is possibly a part of it. It was more that the heightened expectation made me retreat deeper into myself. I had a feeling of physical obstruction, as though I were standing in front of myself. I needed to shove the second self away to open the view to the true self. I was so dull in those months. Wash. At every conversation, a great vacancy would fill my eyes, an air of departure, as if I'd already left the room. I began to get a reputation for being stupid, pretty, and stupid.
Wow, yeah.
You should have did the audiobook.
Yeah. Listen to you keep reading.
It's so interesting that even though like this novel takes place in the 1800s, I feel like any woman who's dressed up on any given day can relate to everything that she's saying. Tiana is no fool. She's able to read, acknowledge, and add to her father's works. And for her to get a reputation of being stupid, it stood out to me. Is that what we expect of beautiful women? We can look at them, we can eye them, but we don't expect anything from them. I just need you to be there. I need to feel a sense of worth in my proximity to you. You are there to adorn the room and to adorn me or my ego or whatever it is that I think. As long as you look good, who needs you to be smart? And that scene really stood out to me and really spoke to Tiana's character, because for the rest of the novel, you don't see her in a pretty dress. You don't see her wearing shiny jewelry, but she is beautiful nonetheless. And I thought that was a very, very interesting way to explore femininity, beauty, and like the female's role in society.
Yeah, I don't know what you could possibly add to that. It's the emphasis on the outside degrades the emphasis on the inside.
That to me sounds like a great place to leave it in a way. Do any of you guys have any sort of final thoughts about the novel that you wanted to share? Would you recommend it to others to read? Would you read other books by Esi Edugyan? I have to admit, this was the first book of hers I've read. I haven't read Half-Blood Blues, but based on what I've read here, I think I would want to read that one as well.
Yeah, well, obviously she's incredibly descriptive, but the way she paints each scene, was incredibly vivid. And I thought the way that she even manipulated and put together phrases just to describe locations and places where they ended up was quite brilliant. The story itself is, like I said before, I'm always hesitant to enter into any sort of slave narrative or, a history of slavery or anything. But I think that my takeaway from the book was, I do wish Wash, he was more It's hard to say or expect him to be something given his position and his circumstances, but I wish that sense of chasing approval from Titch wasn't necessary. And I think that's still a common reality in society, and people of color always chasing after that white approval or acknowledgement or acceptance. And that theme within the book is quite real in it, and it stood out to me. But yeah, the characters were so interesting, but I have a hard time showing any sort of sympathy or empathy towards any of the white people in the text because of the position that and the time that it was in. It was like I very much just wanted to hear more and more and more about Wash and about Big Kit and about the Black characters.
Well, and also, like, you know, Titch's family is so weird. And at the end, when Titch is saying to Wash, well, I treated you like family, I'm thinking, like, well, that's not a great thing. If this is,
that is not like family.
With family like this, who needs family?
Exactly. Exactly.
There was a quote in the book where Titch, this is before Titch abandoned Wash, or just before he abandoned Wash, and he said, do you understand what a family is? Like, if you understood what family is, then you would see there's no need for it. Or something along those lines. And that line always stood out to me. It's odd. I found myself relating to Titch in a lot of ways, or just, I really liked his character. I found it very intriguing, just how he couldn't really be pegged down. You never really knew what he felt or what he was thinking.
Yeah, but emotionally detached.
Exactly. Yeah. In a type of way, but seeing his upbringing, you could understand why. There was two things that really stood out to me within the book. When Titch had made that remark about family, and you look at the strained dynamics between him and his mom, his brother, his dad, you didn't understand how much his dad loved Titch until Titch had disappeared and like presumably died. Like his father literally died the week after his son's disappearance because it was too much for his heart, if you ask me. And then Wash, at the end of the book, I was so disappointed when Wash decided to walk into that sandstorm and disappear. But at the same time, I understood. I didn't feel like Titch had abandoned Wash when he walked into the snowstorm. I felt like he needed to secure his own freedom. And within the book, even though we see Titch almost guiding Wash to Wash's freedom, you see Titch on his own self-discovery, trying to secure his own freedom from his mom, freedom from his dad, freedom from his brother, from his responsibilities, almost just to create. And that was something I feel like I understood within his character. And then when Wash disappeared, I understood that this only makes sense because everyone he ever cared about had done the same thing. When Titch disappeared into the storm, that's how he dealt with his problem. When Philip ended his life, that was how he solved his problems. The father literally died, so that's how he resolved those issues. So when Wash disappeared into the storm, I was like, okay, this is how you find your resolution, I guess. So that was pretty interesting.
I hadn't looked at Titch that way. He's trying to find his, I don't know. I was just spent the whole time so mad at Titch. I don't know.
I was pretty mad at him too. I was just like, I'm not surprised.
But I like how you said that throughout the book, all these things happened to Wash. And in the very end, Wash is taking the initiative and he's walking away from the situation. And it's a very similar situation that he was left in. It was this remote scientific outpost in the middle of a snowstorm. At the end, it's a sandstorm. And yet he's the one that now, his story is unwritten, but we can only speculate what happens next.
Yeah, has built some kind of life on his own, hopefully.
Yes. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe Tiana will search the world.
Yeah. Maybe she'll just save everybody.
What Do the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, Veggie Tales, and the December 2012 edition of Allure magazine have in common? They were all challenged and deemed offensive or inappropriate for certain audiences and were tried to be removed from public libraries and schools. Each one, however, still remains on the shelves. 2019 marks the 35th anniversary of Freedom to Read Week, a week that provides an opportunity for Canadians to focus on issues of intellectual freedom as they affect your community, your province, our country, and countries around the world. This year, we celebrate Freedom to Read Week from February 25th to March 2nd. And what better place to get involved, raise awareness, and celebrate freedom of expression than at your local branch of Winnipeg Public Library. Visit book and informational displays at various branches around the city, and be sure to drop by Henderson Library during the week to get your photo taken for their mugshot wall. Get caught reading a banned or challenged book. The freedom to read is your right. Protect it, and let's defend it together.
But we don't have to speculate what happens next, because what happens next is our segment called Tell Me About a Book You Also Like, which is the time in our podcast where we go around and we talk about another book that we think that our listeners may enjoy if they've enjoyed the current one that we discussed. So in this case, Washington Black. Did anyone want to go first with their book pick?
I'll go. Okay. I abhor spoilers. So this is a book that has been on my list for almost at least half a year, and I have still yet to buy it, but it's called The Children of Blood and Bone, and the author, if I'm not mistaken, is of Nigerian descent, and his name is Tomi Adeyemi. So it's spelled Tomi and then Adeyemi. So it's a Nigerian-American author, and the reason I think that if you liked Washington Black, that you'll like The Children of Blood and Bone is like it's another fictional novel based around like Black bodies and their experience within the world, but it's not a slave narrative. It's something completely different. And so it takes you outside of the realm of what's expected when you hear Black characters and stories, but it still has an emotional depth. My brother read the book. He recommended it to me after I'd put it on my list. I refuse any more spoilers, but you should definitely check it out.
Is that one part of a series? I thought maybe it might be book one in a series, which would be cool.
Oh,
it might be book one in the series.
Because it looks amazing, yeah.
I'll go next. I'll stick with Canadian writers. And last year we had the pleasure, was it last year? No, it wasn't. It's 2019. It was 2 years ago. We had the pleasure of hosting David Sheriandi with his book Brother in partnership with the Critical Race Network at the University of Winnipeg. And I got to introduce him. He's fantastic. And I won't give any spoilers because I don't like that either. But go read it. And it's a beautiful story. Black folks growing up in Toronto and Scarborough, I believe. And yeah, it was a fantastic read. And I think it's on our list for Black History Month with the Public Library and Blackspace. We developed a list. So February is Black History Month and I Love to Read Month. So we encourage you to read, but it's really Black History Year. So read those books past February, people.
We can put a link to that list on our website
on
too.
Our show notes. Yeah.
Definitely.
Great.
So I had a couple books pop to mind, not necessarily as read-alikes, but as things that I thought of. So the first one is that I do want to really recommend Half-Blood Blues. It's one of those books that I really, really loved. But also, when they were sailing around in the balloon, I couldn't stop thinking about James and the Giant Peach because that book made a big impression on me of like the silently floating through the sky thing. So I couldn't get that out of my head. But then the other thing that it reminded me of is Underground Railroad, because that was also escaped slaves and they're on this sort of semi-fantastical journey with the actual train that goes under the ground. And they end up in all these different places and seeing how all these different people live and trying to figure out what they are going to do and what they want from their lives. So it reminded me also of Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead.
And if you want to hear more about the Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, you can find an earlier episode of Time to Read where we spend the entire time talking about that book. So there's a little plug for the back issues.
I didn't do that on purpose, but that would have been good. Yeah.
The book that I picked it because it also deals with 19th century scientific discoveries made by unconventional scientists. But in this case, the scientist is a woman who becomes a botanist specializing in mosses and who develops a theory of competitive alteration, which is very similar to Darwin's theory of evolution. But guess which one the historians remember? It was published in 2013 and it is called The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, who you may recognize that name as being the person who wrote a little book called Eat, Pray, Love, which people were all about maybe 10 years ago. And so this book, The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, is about this, like I said, the scientist, Alma Whitaker, and how she makes her way in the world. And she travels around the world too, as well. And there's lots of adventures. And it's written, the words that Elizabeth Gilbert writes, just like Esi Edugyan, in the style of a 19th century scholar. So she uses a lot of words that would be used during that period and phrasing. And it's just a very rich, wonderful, layered book to read that I recommend. So thanks, everybody. So now it's time for Nerd Word for Word Nerds, the part of each show where each of our hosts pick a word, define it, and then explains why it's been tickling their tongue for the past month. So who wants to start off?
I'll go just because I've been practicing the pronunciation in my head. I'm still going to get it wrong. Okay, so my word is ipsedixitism. And I got this word from a lady named Susie Dent on Twitter. She's a British lexicographer that I know from a British comedy show called 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown, which is in itself a parody of Countdown, which is a British show that she's also on. But I don't watch the real one. I watch the parody, funny one.
Wow, that's like comedy Inception.
So anyway, yeah, it's like layers and layers. But anyway, she's the lady who on the show, people are trying to spell words and she tells them whether or not it's a word. She's like the word expert. Anyway, so she has an amazing Twitter account where she has words of the day and she explains crazy word facts. So ipsedixitism is a dogmatic assertion of a fact, in quotation marks, without giving any supporting evidence. And it's from the Latin, he said it. And it's something that it's from a Greek expression used by disciples of Pythagoras to justify any argument that they chose. It's like, well, he said it, so it must be true. Okay, I'm going to try to do it one more time. Ipsedixitism is my word nerd.
Very good.
Nerd word.
Dixitism. I'm going to use that now. That brings me back to when you're arguing with your siblings and your mom catches you. Yeah. Well, it wasn't me. He said it.
Well, it reminded me of when my mom would ask me to do something and I'd say, why? And she'd say, well, because I'm your mother. Because I said so.
There's no further argument needed.
Nah, no kidding.
Perfect. Yeah. It's funny because I had a word and the word I had in mind was lifeless. Because this book took a lot out of me. I felt really heavy when I finished it. Oh my God. Yeah. It was one of those themes that they really explored in the book, the darkness within us, the violence within us, and the urge that's there and whether or not you choose to explore it or what happens when you do. And then his disappearance into that sandstorm. And I was I just felt lifeless and numb. Yeah. I'm ugh. But after this conversation, I retract my word.
Whoa, this is a nerd word first, everybody.
A twist.
And I'll put reinvigorated because this conversation was really reinvigorating for me.
Yay.
Beautiful. I will pick something not related to the book at all because I heard this word maybe a couple weeks ago and I couldn't stop thinking about it, called blackfishing. And if you know about you know about catfishing, do we all know what catfishing is?
Yeah, but why don't you just maybe in case our listeners don't.
Okay, so if you don't know what catfishing is, it's basically people falling in love with people online and then falling in love with the person that they didn't think they fell in love with. So blackfishing is basically, I can't remember who came up with this. There's so many new terms coming up on social media these days and in the Urban Dictionary realm. But blackfishing is when the kind of aesthetic appropriation of Black women that white women are doing and making their filters on Instagram darker, enhancing features to make them look more, in quote, ethnic. So they essentially get more attention and likes on social media. And that made sense when I heard it, but I didn't know there was a term for it. And, the term blackfishing is you think of folks like the Kardashians as a great example of doing things like that. And completely not related to the book at all, but in some ways, maybe yes.
It's one of those words.
Yeah, it's one of those words that I was blackfishing. That's what's up. I'm glad someone came up with a word for that.
That's awesome. I'll bring it back to the book just briefly in that my nerd word comes from one sentence in the book from page 273 when Wash collects that octopus. And he says, I could see by the tentacles on the third arm that she was a female. And I kept coming back to that line thinking what? So I looked up how octopus, this is another thing. But before we started recording, we had discussion. What's the plural for octopus? Some people say octopi. I've always said octopi. I think it's octopuses.
Octopuses.
You had another word too. What was it?
Octopody.
Octopody
is supposed to be the correct one.
I like octopody.
And I think it's in the book.
Yeah.
In the book,
Tiana
she corrects him by saying it's octopody because it's Greek.
I just want to say that I don't think there are enough words that the plural ends with an I. Like, for example, cacti.
That's right.
I love it.
Yeah.
Cacti, octopi. But even if octopi is not right. Anyway, that's not my nerd word. My nerd word is, I'm going to mispronounce this, Hectocotylus. And what this is it's sort of the appendage on a male octopus. And so the third arm, if you will, apparently they're called arms, not tentacles. Apparently, who knew? But I'm not a scientist, so I have no idea how correct any of this is. But apparently, the male octopus and some octopody, they'll detach that arm, and then it goes over to the lady octopus, where she stores it until she lays eggs. And then, sadly, both of them die.
Wow.
Yeah. So, sorry to bring everyone down.
I don't know if I'm like down or like superly like fascinated.
Yeah.
So, I think we could do a whole episode just on what octopuses get up to. Octopodes. But
Octopody episode
maybe
of
we'll
Octopody facts.
Let's leave it at that. So thank you so much, dear readers, for joining us on the lucky 13th episode of the Time to Read podcast. And thank you to Alexa and Sappfyre for being here. That was awesome. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we have. Please join us next month when we welcome Kirsten and Alan back to discuss The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. This podcast is way more fun when you get involved, so email us at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca with your comments or find us on Facebook. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rate and review on iTunes. And until next time, make sure you find
Time to read.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Time to Read. We were discussing Washington Black by Esi Edugyan. Time to Read is a production of the Winnipeg Public Library. Our panel today included Trevor Lockhart, Erica Ball, and special guests Sappfyre McLeod and Alexa Potashnik from Blackspace Winnipeg. Our webmaster is Aaron Seaburn. Our social media guru is Regan Brew. Audio production and music by Dennis Penner. We want you to be part of our show too. Email us at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca with suggestions for books that you'd like us to read and discuss, and comments and questions about the book we're reading for our next show. Visit us on the web at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca. Check out our show notes with links to some of the things we talked about today, and take part in a discussion about the books we're reading. You can also check out our Facebook group. Have you ever wanted to see the Time to Read crew in person? We'll be doing a live podcast on Tuesday evening, March 26th at the Goodwill Social Club. We hope to see you there. Next month, Alan and Kirsten will be back. We're reading The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, and we're looking forward to hearing what you think about it. All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I ever really need is a little more time to read.
Just
Okay.
so.
Making sure my mouth works.
It's always a good thing.
Wait a minute. It's stuck. It's stuck,
Yeah.
guys.
It's no longer a part of me.